Good evening. Welcome to tonight's conversation with esteemed epidemiologist Glenn Grossman. I'm Rebecca Berman and thrilled to be moderating this conversation. As always, if you have questions during our conversation, please send them to me via the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and I will do my best to weave your question into our conversation. And thank you to everybody that has sent questions in beforehand. We have a lot to cover tonight. Glenn Grossman is an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience. While pursuing his doctorate in epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, Glenn served as an epidemiologist on staff at the UNC Infectious Disease Clinic for 2 years and taught epidemiology and advanced analytics at Duke Medical School and at UNC. He has been involved in epidemiology forecasting and advanced analytics with Bristol Myers Squibb, Sanofi, Novartis, Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Administration, the Military Health Service, the CDC, and other programs within the United States and abroad. All views expressed today are his own. Okay, Glenn, take us around the country and around the world. How's everything looking?
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, let's start in the United States. So at a high level, here's what we're looking at. This is where most of the cases are occurring, just in terms of the volume of cases. But if we're interested in transmission, what the risk of community transmission is, you'll see that it's pretty much red in much of the country. There's a few exceptions. So in some of these southern countries, so Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, as well as Louisiana, it's considered substantial rather than high. And I'm not quite sure why Maryland is blue right now. And I don't know if it's a data issue or what's going on there. If we look at, let's go to the New York Times. So if we go to New York Times, it looks like it's just a data issue and that's what's driving it for some reason. But you can see that there's this interesting non-random pattern of cases. So we know that there is a seasonal effect of COVID, both in the north, so it's for the Northern Hemisphere that we're talking about. So, but even within the North and the South of the United States, the South, which was doing well, you see is starting to have an increase in cases as winter months proceed for a variety of reasons. We've talked about some of them previously. So for instance, kids going back to school and then transmitting it around and for a variety of reasons. But what we see now, if we look up here regionally, so this is, I'm looking at the New York Times dashboard on this, which I found useful, is that when you look here, it's not just the Northeast that's really getting worse, and it's not just the Midwest. We are also seeing an increase in the South, just the beginning of one. And if you notice back in around this time of last year, maybe a little bit later than we were last year, the Midwest started rising more rapidly than the rest of the country after the summer surge 2 summers ago in 2020. And then, so that you saw this rise in the Midwest, we sort of are seeing the same type of pattern here. Then that was followed by surges in all of the regions, with a sort of a delay in the South, but still not so far delayed. It was roughly the same. Here we had this major surge in the South with Delta, a surge in other places. They weren't hit as hard as the South, but you see that now that pretty much every region is starting to increase again. The West is a little bit under control, but still something that we're looking out for. So you see that there's a lot of areas of spread. It's just seasonality of it. When we look at the vaccination rates, this is not actually a great way to do it. It's too detailed at the county level. Let's first look at the hospitalization rates. It's still following the same trend. You see that some counties are doing worse than others. And so you can be in a state as a whole that's doing poorly. But then even within those states, say some of these states in the Northeast, the hospitalization rate might not be so bad in many counties. So some counties are being hit harder than others. When we look at the vaccine rates, and so now I can jump to that. Whoops. All right, so there was, some of you might have noticed in the news, there was an issue with the CDC's data quality with their vaccination program. They had previously been saying that over 99% of people over the age of 65 have been vaccinated with at least one dose. And it doesn't seem like that's the case. It seems like the data was corrupted because some people are getting boosters at the different age groups and saying that it's their first dose. And so it's hard as a result for the CDC to know whether it's truly a first dose or a booster to someone who's already gotten it. Right now, our best estimate is probably around 95%. So they've corrected this data, and probably around 95% of people over age 65 are now have had at least one dose. And among people who are fully vaccinated, that's not among, so 87% among people age 65 and over are fully vaccinated. This makes a difference because, so this number is a little bit lower than what we've been talking about before, because these people are certainly at the highest risk. And so every single percentage point there, we're talking about a lot of people. And so as a result, getting these numbers right becomes very important. When we were looking at the country as a whole, approximately 61% of the country as a whole are fully vaccinated, which is great news. Full vaccination has a really good protective effect against Delta. For Omicron, it's going to be a little bit more problematic. With Omicron, the booster shots are going to be more important. And we can already see among people who are fully vaccinated, a little bit more than a quarter of them have gotten booster shots, and a little bit more than a half of people age 65 and over. We'll talk a lot about the booster shots this afternoon. There's a lot of really interesting information. So far, there's that. So that's the vaccines. Let's go into the pediatric data just very quickly. Let's not do that. Let's look at demographic trends. That's what I'll. All right, and so now when we look at the cases, so we were seeing an increased spike, particularly in the 5 to 11-year-olds. This is the dashed line. So solid line is 12 to 17, dashed line is 5 to 11, and then the dotted ones on the bottom are 0 to 4. We noticed that there was a rapid increase in the 5 to 11-year-olds, but there might be some signals that it's starting to decrease a little bit as a percentage. And so that's good news for the kids. But the problem is it's maybe just decreasing as a percentage, but we are in another surge. We are in a winter surge for Delta. So if we go back and look at this code CDC. So here's where we're looking at. So I showed you regionally what it looks like. For the aggregate, you see that we are on an upward trend again. And so we're not where we were, but we're still hitting on average close to 120,000 new infections a day. So that's a lot around the United States. In addition, we estimate that maybe we're capturing 50% or less of infections are actually being diagnosed. So that means we could easily be having 250,000 cases a day that are going on now. When we're looking at hospitalizations and deaths, so here's the hospital admission rate. Let me see, this is just in general. Let me see if I can get it per day or per 7 days. No. All right, that's fine. So the hospital admissions are still high. Let me look here at 7-day deaths. Let me look at daily deaths. All right, so at this point now, we have an average number of deaths in the United States right now for COVID at approximately 1,150. So on average, every day, that's how many people are still dying from COVID. We're not quite as bad as where we were this time last year. So December 8th, we were already far up on our upward side of this mountain. with the surge going up there. And so we were already quite a bit higher, but we do expect that the surge is going to be continuing and it's going to get higher here. I've continued to say for a while now that within the next few months to a year, pretty much everyone in the United States will either be infected or have been infected, vaccinated, or dead. And so there's still a lot of people who have not been infected and have not been vaccinated. And so those people, there's no herd immunity. We talked about the concept previously. That's not something that we can really talk about here. If you recall, herd immunity was this idea that we saw it with polio and measles and other viruses and other contagions, that if enough people get vaccinated, you can actually eliminate all of the virus out of society. And so there's actually no spread. There's no virus, or the pathogen doesn't exist in the society anymore because you've eliminated it through vaccination. In this case, we're not going to be able to eliminate the virus. It's with us forever now. It's endemic. So the question is just, what's the impact of that going to be? And the impact is probably, a lot of us believe, it's going to eventually look more like a cold.
It's a pesto sauce.
Rebecca, if you
Isaac
can.
said it's good with the olives.
All right, great. Whoops. All right, there. So yeah, and so basically we're going to be looking at colds. Like, so right now there are 4 other coronaviruses that are very common in
Glenn,
the
excuse me for Glenn, excuse me. We your camera shifted and it's away from you now.
Oh, that's not.
There you are. You're back. Okay.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah. So basically, there a lot of people keep forgetting that there's 4 other coronaviruses that are. It's like a pandemic in terms of they're everywhere. We're all infected by them regularly. We have been throughout all our lives. We might get infected once every year, maybe a couple times a year. Some people only get infected once every few years. It varies, but the virus is circulating. But because we were all exposed at such a young age to the first time, maybe before we were even 1 or 2 years old, we just have cold symptoms throughout the rest of our life at every time that we're re-exposed and reinfected. And so we don't even notice it. Most of the time it's asymptomatic. That's likely what's going to happen with COVID-19, with SARS-CoV-2. The problem is, it's not that the virus itself is becoming less severe per se. It's that we've developed an immune response from a young age. And so once all of us have been vaccinated or infected, and we're just talking about reinfections after the vaccination or after the infection, then it's going to be a less severe disease. It's going to be just like a common cold. But for people who have not been vaccinated or infected, it's their first time. And so it's going to be a more severe illness for quite a lot of them. And so even if they escape the getting infected for 3 years, and so in let's say 2024 is the first time they're infected with SARS-CoV-2, they somehow escaped all these years, that will be their first time that their immune system is exposed, and they could have a severe reaction at that point. It's not that the virus itself has gone tame and is just slowed down. It's that it's a mixture of the two. It's our immune systems are just realize it's not as big a threat, and so we treat it as a cold. All right, we've talked about this. Let's see. I'll jump to Omicron in a second. Let me just look at the worlds real quickly. So here's the global map. So like I've been saying a lot, this is a seasonal type of virus, similar to cold and flu and pneumonia. And so we see right now in the northern hemisphere we're approaching winter, that we are having a lot of spread there. All right, this is deaths actually, so it's not as bright a map as I was looking, but they do overlap a lot. This is cases. One thing that I can point out quickly, and I'll show you again, I do want to get to questions soon, but you'll notice here, particularly in Western Europe, see how dark red it is for all the cases that are still spreading? But when you flip from that to deaths, you'll notice that a lot of Western Europe is not as dark red anymore, that the dark red has really shifted a little bit to sort of Eastern Europe. And the reason for that, of course, is the vaccination rates. We know that the vaccinations work. And so And so when you look at countries, whoops, let me go over here. We can continue on the map. When you look at the countries, you can see that it matches with the same colors that we're looking at. The countries that had higher vaccinations, darker green, even though there have continued spread of the cases, their death rates have plummeted. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the lower hospitalization, the lower death rates that are all we care about. The countries over here that have lower vaccination rates, their caseload is high. Whoops. Their caseload, well, some of their cases are not quite as high right now for a variety of reasons. They will be high as Omicron continues to spread, but their death rate is higher. So these some of these countries in particular. Anyway, let's go back. So this was the key things I wanted to talk about there. I'll skip that. All right, let's see. Let's talk about South Africa. All right, here's South Africa. South Africa is now in its fourth surge. You see that the line is going almost straight up. It seems like this surge doesn't differ very much from the previous surges. Those lines seem to go straight up too. But when you zoom in and compare it for the last one, you can see that the time from, like, if we say like April 30th until it reached, let's say 250 cases per. So it took from May 1st to almost the end of June to get to 250 cases per million people. So let's call that roughly 60 days. So before May 1st, it was closer to like April 30th or so. May 1st, so we can call it May and June. So almost 60 days to reach 250 per million people. Here, if we started November 23rd to the 9th, then we're talking about under 20 days compared to the 60 days before. So this, as you can see, really fast. The majority of the spread, again, we always look at these things at the aggregates. When we're talking about South Africa, there's actually lots of states within South Africa. Most of the spread so far has been in a particular one in Gauteng, but we'll dig into that in a little while with some slides and questions that we have. There's a couple other things before we go on, and then I can go to Omicron. Some people always wonder about flu now this time of year. How does this compare? So we saw before the epidemic in March 2020, flu is the dark green and the light green here. So a normal season, we saw, it varies when it starts to hit hard and when it starts to go. But this time of year, we already saw a fairly large amount of flu spread. So 7% or so were flu of the respiratory illnesses that were reported for pathogens spreading. Flu was virtually eliminated for much of the last 2 years after the lockdowns and whatnot. But now it's starting to come back. And over the last week or so, you can see there's 2.5%, 3% of the respiratory pathogens are now flu. Interesting. So there's, like I mentioned, these other cold viruses that are coronaviruses. That's what we're seeing in yellow. And our mask wearing and physical distancing and all this did manage to reduce coronavirus a lot. But even despite that, there is still quite a lot of coronavirus cold spreading, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The reason being that there is some limited evidence that it's possible that people who get vaccinated and get the coronavirus cold virus, some of these other cold viruses, might have additional protection against COVID-19 variants. So when we've talked previously about this idea of hybrid immunity and super immunity, those come, if you recall, when someone is vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine and has also been infected with the COVID-19 virus. And so those two sort of, they have a synergistic effect on the protection. It does seem that even though these other coronaviruses are not COVID-19, there might be some additional protection that the immune system might be aware of it and realize it's similar enough to COVID-19 that it might provide some additional protection. We don't know for sure yet, But the fact that there's so much spread of this cold virus might actually be a good thing. It might actually be providing additional immunity to people with the vaccine. All right, so that's where we are here. Let me close this. Let's turn to Omicron. And you can pronounce it either way, Omicron, Omicron. It's basically an accent thing. And so you can't really say one accent is better than the other. So it doesn't really matter which one you use. But here's where Omicron has been detected around the world. You can see that it's spread out since the last time we talked a couple of weeks ago. It's spread dramatically. It is in most countries right now. In countries where it has not been diagnosed, it's probably a diagnosis issue. It's probably there and it just hasn't been diagnosed. And so it's been found in lots of places. All right, now let's talk about Omicron. So this is a big distinction we need to make is when Omicron is detected in a traveler versus when it's detected in local transmission. The reason is if Omicron is detected with screening programs for people who have returned from travel, then that one case only represents that one person because they're screened and they were caught as they were coming back into the country. In contrast, if Omicron is detected in someone with local transmission, then that means it was most likely randomly identified. And if that's the case, then right now, we're only diagnosing, as I mentioned just a little bit before, around half or less of our cases, of our infections. So that means that every one case actually represents more that are out there that we're not diagnosing. In addition, our genetic sequencing in the United States is very poor. It varies by country. I don't know if I pulled out here a quick list. I think I have it somewhere. How well are we sequencing? It's a useful list, so I just want to pull it up real quickly. Let me see. I think I passed it. So some countries are doing remarkably well at sequencing. So Iceland, it's a much smaller country. But they're sequencing over half of all of their COVID cases that are being diagnosed. Denmark is almost half. Do you see some of these other countries smaller, but they're still diagnosing a lot? Australia is doing well. United Kingdom is diagnosing almost 13%. And so that's a lot for a country of that size in terms of the number of cases that they've had. Australia is large. They not had nearly as many cases. But when you come down to the United States, we're only at 3.5%. And so that means that every one case of Omicron that's sequenced probably represents another 30 that are out there just because of our rate is so low, 30 that are out there that are diagnosed with COVID, but we didn't realize they were Omicron. And because of the diagnosis rate, then that means it's probably a total of 60 cases with Omicron or infections with Omicron for every one that we sequence. So that means that it's already spreading rapidly, but under the radar, so we're not seeing it. In fact, there was a study in the UK. I don't think I put a slide together there that suggests that that by middle of December, so we're practically already there, within the next week to 10 days, over half of all COVID-19 spread in the United Kingdom will be Omicron. In fact, let's go back here for a second. So here's variants. So you can see that so red is Omicron variant. It is growing over time in lots of countries. You can see in all these countries that I've pulled up, these are the ones we've been looking at for a lot of weeks now. It's been found everywhere already, so to some to a greater extent. In United Kingdom, again, we're looking here. This was only 1.14% when it was just done over the last day or two was Omicron. So for them to expect that it's going to be around 50% within the next couple of weeks, that is heavy spread. So we'll see what that looks like. In fact, when we look at the table here of the countries that were the most Omicron has been found, So in South Africa, virtually 100% is Omicron now. Ghana has a very high percentage. Botswana is slow and growing. But some of these you'll notice the last it was done was November 29th. So that's an eon ago. I mean, it's already December 12th now. And so the fact that they haven't sequenced for a while, it just means that it's invisible to us. It doesn't mean that it's not spreading there. It's just invisible. Germany, it's already at over 11%. France, oh, not Germany. Yeah. Oh, no, not Germany. Sorry. This is Spain, where it's over 11%. France is almost 7% now. So you see, a lot of countries are being hit, and it's just spreading really rapidly. Was that the only thing I wanted to say with Omicron? Yeah, that's it for now for Omicron. Let's Rebecca, open it to questions now.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. As always, we appreciate you sharing what's happening at home and how that compares to what's happening around the world. Really, really helpful. Lots of questions this week about Omicron. Maybe before we jump into the Omicron questions, before we began our discussion tonight, Sandy posed a great question about mask wearing indoors at this moment, when there are standards in place at a restaurant or at a show where everybody who is entering must show proof of vaccination. What are your thoughts on wearing that mask?
All right, so there's a couple things. People who are vaccinated can still get infected. So this is what we've been saying. So the benefit of the vaccine is that it prevents severe disease, prevents hospitalization, prevents death. But people can still get infected and develop colds or potentially even worse. So not like maybe more like flu-like symptoms that are not enough for people to be hospitalized per se, but still make you uncomfortable. So the question is, if you wear a mask, if you see, this is not what I wanted. I want to see this one. So if you're in a state now where there's a lot of spread, then maybe you want to avoid getting real sick in the next week or so, and so you might want to wear the mask. With Omicron spreading, we don't know how severe it's going to be yet. We'll talk about that in a little while. But it could be severe, and so we don't know. The risk of infection is still there. It's the risk of severe disease that's gone down a lot. But the other thing is and the risk varies dramatically. So if we go to the other one, the New York Times website, which I like this one a lot, it varies much on a county level. So if you're in a county in Florida where there's not much spread, then that's a very different answer than if you're in a county in New Jersey where there's a lot of spread, or another northeastern region state. And so that might impact your thinking. I believe that by May, and I've been saying this by maybe late March, maybe May, we'll be looking at most of this being done in the United States. Because at that point, the surges are happening so fast, and the vaccinations are still happening, that by that time, the vast majority of Americans, and by that I mean probably over 90% of Americans, if not more, maybe 90-95%, will have been either infected or vaccinated. And so at that point, even though the remaining 5 to 10% will still be at risk, we won't really have the surges that we've talked about before. And so they'll get it over time, but it just won't be this massive surge type of thing. So at that point, then maybe would be a better time to take off the masks and that kind of stuff. But until then, the fact that we are still seeing what I was showing you, 1,500 or 1,200 cases of deaths of COVID a day, that's still a lot of people dying every single day from COVID. It's not too much lower than where we were a year from now. And so however many precautions you were taking then should still probably be around the precautions that you're doing now based on the burden that we're seeing, the deaths and the hospitalizations and whatnot. Again, it does vary dramatically by county, so that can go into your thinking. And yeah, that's where we're at.
All right. Thank you, Sandy, for that great question. And Glenn, thank you for your detailed analysis. Jeff, if you could please unmute and ask your question about PCR testing.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the US PCR test can identify the S gene missing in the Omicron, or just in general, which countries that you know of have that ability.
Yeah, so there's two different answers. In fact, let me go to that real quickly. I didn't put a good slide together on this, but I have the question. So first there's this idea, SGTF, S gene target failure. And so basically a lot of the diagnostic tests use 3 targets on the SARS-CoV-2 virus to test to see if we have it. And the reason being that if there were mutations, that if you still got 2 targets positive, then you could say, okay, it's still a positive test result or a probable positive. The S gene is eliminated as part of the Omicron variant. And so some people say, well, maybe we can just, instead of having to genetically sequence all the cases, maybe we can just look at the diagnostic tests. And if the S gene is missing as part of the 3, then that might be just an easy way to see if it's Omicron or not, or to track Omicron. The problem is that there's S gene target failure in Delta and some of the others that we saw. I think Alpha had S gene target failure. So the biggest question is, among all of the S gene target failure diagnosis results, what percentage of them are Omicron? And so they've looked at this in the United Kingdom, where Omicron is more widespread than in the United States. And what they found is that, as it makes sense, is that as you have an increase in Omicron, then the percentage of false positives from the S gene target failure actually goes way down. And so very rapidly, day over day and week over week, it becomes a better instrument for just detecting Omicron versus some of these others. Just because if you see S gene target failure, it's going to become more and more likely that Omicron is driving it rather than another variant. All right, Rebecca.
Okay, great. Thanks for that great question, Jeff. Okay, let's talk about the booster, Glenn. Lots of questions about the booster. Folks want to know, when are folks kind of fully protected, or as my daughter says, fully activated once they get their booster shot? And how protective are the current booster shots available today against Delta, against Omicron, et cetera?
All right, so a couple things. First, when you see, these are where the lines start to deviate. These are the people up here who had no booster, but they were fully vaccinated. These are the people down here who got the booster shot. So when you compare where it starts to be having an impact, if they had the booster on day 0, you can see, so on other slides, other studies have demonstrated that by day 6, you already start to see some antibody impacts, but this is looking at the hazard of actually getting reinfected and or getting severe disease. I think it was reinfection looking in this one. This was mortality. And so you can see that when you actually look at endpoints that make more of an important aspect in terms of our thinking, we really don't start to see very much separation until maybe 12, 20 days, where it really starts to jump. And so at this point, I would say maybe 20 days is when you really start to see the biggest separation. You do start to see a signal at around 12 to 14 days. Previously, we've been saying 2 weeks for the other doses. And you do start to see a signal at 14 days, but it really doesn't really start to see the big benefit of the booster until further time has passed. And one of the interesting things about the booster is that the more time that passes, the better it seems to be doing. So let me look at a couple other slides here. One of my favorite pictures is coming up. All right, and that's this one. Let me make this bigger.
Only an epidemiologist, by the way, would call this a favorite picture. I do need to point that out.
Oh, this will be
To
yours.
The rest of us, we are
oh.
curious to hear what you have to say.
You speak too soon. Give me a second to explain it, and I think you'll be really appreciating this graph too. All right, so let's look at what this is saying. So the y-axis here is how effective it is at neutralizing the virus. All right. And so the higher it is, the better it is. Green is the original Wuhan variant, or whatever by wild type. That is what was active in the wild around the time that all these vaccines were created. So that's green. It was the original recipes, as you were. One of the questions was, the first question is, how much does it decrease over time, and how much does the booster help with that? So you can see between 7 days after the second dose to 1 month after the second dose, it may be decreased a little bit imperceptibly, but it's roughly same order of magnitude. But then between the first month after the second dose, so when they've had full vaccination, to 6 months later, you can see there was a pretty steep drop in the protection. So going from green to green, a pretty steep drop. When they got the booster, 7 days after the booster, you see not only did it boost it back up to previous levels, it actually went almost an order of magnitude higher. So we're not talking about boosting as like bringing us back to where we were for the second dose. Boosting is almost like it's boosting it far higher than the second dose even, which is really, really good news. And a lot of people are even now thinking that someone shouldn't be fully vaccinated unless they have 3 doses now, because it's not really just bringing you back to the previous second dose. You're actually boosting it to a much higher level. That's the first insight. And we see the same thing both for people under 65 and also people over 65. However, for people over 65, it's even more pronounced. That's the first thing I wanted to show. The second thing is, you saw that there was a drop. Let's look at the 65 to 85-year-olds. Between 7 days after the second dose and 1 month, you see that there was a slight drop in the efficacy of the vaccine, and it dropped even further by the 6 month. Here's a fascinating thing. When you look at the booster, you boost up far higher than the original vaccine, the second dose did. But even more interesting is that a month after the booster, it seems to be slightly higher even than a week after the booster. So the booster is really, really powerful against the original variants. This is all good news. It's amazing, astonishing even. There seems to be something going on about the delay. It's not just the fact that it's a third dose, it's the delay of 6 months that interacts with our maturing immune system's response to the COVID-19 virus that is sort of enabling us to have this much more robust impact. But the last thing I want to show you on this slide, which is equally important, is beta. So the beta variant is just a random variant. It hit South Africa hard. And so one question was, well, let's use the beta variant just as a proxy to see how well the vaccines, which were not developed for the beta was the one that the vaccines worked the least well against. And beta, the reason it's interesting for us with Omicron is that beta shares a lot of the same mutations with Omicron. And so if the reason we think Omicron is likely to be so resistant to vaccines and to previous immunity is because in large part of the mutations it shares with beta. So beta is a key concern for us now. And so when you look at beta, in truth, when you look at a week after the second dose, there was less coverage, for less protection. You can see that there was still some, so there's some protection, just it was less than with the wild type. It decreased a little over time, and by the time you got to 6 months, it decreased a fair amount. There was still some protection, but it had decreased a fair amount. The same thing with people over the age of 65, it decreased even more. And so if people had gotten infected with beta, it would have been far worse at 6 months' time. However, with the booster, look at how much the booster had an impact on beta. Instead of this difference that we saw between the wild type and beta to begin with the second dose, the booster, and remember, the boosters are not for Omicron. The boosters were developed based on the same wild type variant. But for some reason, when you engage this long-term immune process, it actually has not just a boosting of the absolute quantity of antibodies, it also diversifies your antibody response and T cells and other parts of the immune system. But the key thing I want to say is it diversifies your immune response. And so beta actually has a more important response here than it did at the beginning relative to the wild type. Like here, you can see it's almost as good as the wild type is, which is astonishing. And for me, I interpret this as if this holds true for Omicron, then there is a really good possibility that we will not need any Omicron boosters. I mean, we still have this question of the duration of the boosters. The fact that this is staying high or growing even more over time means that the booster duration is likely to be far, far longer than the 6-month duration that we could expect from the 2 doses. So that's good news. And then this idea of the diversification, the fact that it actually gets more diverse over time with the booster is really, really good news. And so, so that's that. Yeah.
All
That's
right,
enough.
Glenn, I stand corrected. I really like this picture a lot too. I'm not an epidemiologist, but yeah, thank you for that description. Jeff had a follow-up question regarding the duration between the first, second dose and boost. Jeff, if you could ask your question, please.
Yeah, a lot of countries are switching the boosters now to 3 months, or like here in Australia, we're doing 5 months now for the boosters. Is there any data that, or do you know anything about whether or not that's changing that effect? Is it going to be a much lower? Is that something we still don't have data on?
So yeah, I don't personally know a lot about that question. I can try to look it up for next time. I know that we have seen this type of variation in the impact of the vaccine based on the window of time, the time delay for other types of pathogens that we vaccinated against. And so we do know it's there. I think that there are people out there who know something about it. I don't know that it's been studied a lot for SARS-CoV-2 in particular. I know that some countries in Europe, some other places, for the AstraZeneca, they had a 2-dose regimen there, and they extend. Whereas in the United States, we had 3 to 4 weeks between the first and second dose. There, they had closer to a few months, I think, between the first and second dose. And so, and in addition to that, we saw a much more robust response from and longer term response from their vaccines. And that was probably related to this delay, this lag in getting the second dose. I don't know, does 5 months, is that almost as good as 6 months? Would 10 months be even better? Like, I don't know the answers around those different questions now. 6 months seems to be great. And so everyone should be doing it at 6 months. My point is that if you're eligible for the 3rd dose, and it's only like a month or 2 after, it's probably not, you're not going to engage the same part of the immune system. The immune system is complicated, and there's the short-term immune system response, that's we've been looking at antibodies and that kind of stuff, but there's much longer processes that mature over a much longer period of time. And to engage those, you're really talking about re-exposures over months or years. And so it's different immune system processes that we're trying to engage in. All right, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Appreciate your questions. A couple more questions about Omicron, and then we've got a number of questions coming in about children, particularly children under 5. Let's see, just kind of quick, we'll just kind of go through these. We don't know yet, right, about Omicron, and will it be causing as much severe disease? It sounds like. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I do have a couple quick thoughts. Let me see if I can find it real quickly. That's not it. All right, so far, all right, so far there's a few interesting, there's a lot of data that's been coming in, so we do have some interesting perspectives on this. All right, the first thing to mention before I talk about the graph that's in front of you, so you're distracted now, but the first thing to mention, I can do here, this is good. So the Omicron wave, this is cases in South Carolina, compared to Delta, Beta, and the first wild type, you can see Omicron is exploding out of control. It's just rising so much quicker than the other ones that it's just insane. When you look at this in daily cases that are diagnosed, when you look at it as the percentage of test positive, when you look at it at hospital admissions, these are all increasing. And so you see, I just said hospital admissions are increasing. So the question is, are hospital admissions increasing because of COVID, or is it just so common that everyone's getting diagnosed now that people were just hospitalized for other things, and incidentally, they also happen to have an Omicron diagnosis when they go in? And so let's dig into this a little bit more. Interestingly, when you look at the percentage of those cases that end up going into the intensive care unit, it's a much, much smaller percentage than Delta, which suggests that it's much, much less severe in South Africa. And so we see that in ICUs, we see it as a percentage of patients on ventilators. It's much, much lower, which is great news. One final thing here, this is also ICUs. So it stays very low. So this is good. It's the same, pretty much the same data, I think. All right, but here is the big caveat with South Africa. All right, first of all, South Africa, when the outbreak first started, it started in the university communities. In fact, let me jump over here. When it first started, you can see that in the third wave, the age distribution was more towards older people. So if I can focus on here a little bit more, you see that it was basically the 40 to 70-year-olds who were getting it the most, 40 to 80-year-olds who were the most, and people under 40 were getting it at a lower rate. Maybe people under 30 were getting a much lower rate. With the Omicron, what we saw was a spike in kids under age 5, and then another spike up between the 20 to 40-year-old range, which was a very, very different age distribution. So we know that in younger people, they tend to have less severe disease. And so if we're looking at the fourth wave and trying to compare it to the third wave, of course they're going to have less severe disease because they're much, much younger. And so you'd expect it to be much, much more mild. If it was the same rate of severity, then people would be freaking out way worse than anyone is, because it's all kids and, excuse me, 20 to 40-year-olds who are getting infected. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that South Africa got hit really hard with the previous waves. And so that means that virtually everyone in South Africa has been previously infected. Additionally, as many as a third, I've seen various estimates, but I'd say maybe a third of the population in South Africa has been vaccinated or fully vaccinated at this point. So that means, and presumably those people have super immunity because they were previously infected as well. So that means we know that people who are previously infected also tend to have more mild disease with reinfection. So between the fact that it was younger people and people who were previously infected, then of course, we expect it to be much more mild, and that's indeed what we're seeing. The big question is going to be, when it hits countries that were not hit as hard as South Africa, so that there's a lot of susceptible people, will it be severe for them? And that's still the open question, but we do have a couple answers for that. Oh, and first thing to say here, just because now this age thing might be freaking people out, let's just go here. So we've been tracking age over time. And even though the first couple of weeks definitely saw that was blue, Omicron was much higher in the younger age groups. It's now shifting, and we're seeing it raise to where it looked for the previous Delta distribution. So it's starting to get older and older. It's still curious that we are still seeing a lot in the 20 to 50 to 40 year range, which is odd. The under 5 is coming down, and the over 60 is going back up. But again, so if we compare it to what I was just showing you, here we have the blue, where it was really focused on the 50 to 70-year-olds, and then the distributions around that. It's weird that we have this different age distribution. I don't really fully understand this now. It could be that it's just mostly explained that these are the people who have gotten vaccinated the most. So it's not just a third of the country at large that's gotten vaccinated. It's mostly just a large percentage of these people, and that might be what's causing it. I'm not sure, but it's the age distribution that's related to this in terms of infections and severity of disease. But
just to clarify, the slide you're showing right now, what is that representing? South Africa, or is that representing?
So
what are we looking at here?
This one state in South Africa called Gauteng, if I mispronounced
Got
this
it.
right. But this is the one that was hit hardest. And so that's why it's good to look at it. And so there was this very terrifying concern because a lot of kids under age 6 or age 5 have not been vaccinated yet. And so if this were to be a real thing, then would be worried. But it looks like it's mostly just an artifact and it's going down now. So it's not really anything that a lot of us are worried about. But it was the reason that some of the hospitalizations included more kids under the age of 5. But there's a couple other things I want to show you that are really, really important. First, let's look at this one. So this is I'll look at this one. This is hospitalizations. So you'll notice in Gauteng, which is that state we just talked about, there was a 500% or 455% increase in hospital admissions. So that's huge. But again, it's this open question of, are they going into the hospital with COVID as an incidental diagnosis or because of COVID? And like I said, right now, the total hospitalizations don't really seem to be rising very much. And so, and as well, the intensive care unit, the ventilators are not rising very much. So that means that right now, they're mostly incidental. People are breaking their arms for going bike riding. They are going in for other issues and happen to also have a COVID. It's kind of like having a cold, being screened and being diagnosed because you have a cold. So it's not so worrisome. The thing that's given me the most excitement is coming up. Oh, these two things. First is I'll show you this one. And so what we're looking at here, so the way a PCR test works, a polymerase chain reaction test works, is they actually amplify the signal over and over and over again to try to see if you have the virus. And so typically they might amplify it 20, 30, 40, 50 times. And the more times you amplify it, or you need to amplify it, the smaller the signal. Because if it's a strong signal, then that means you don't have to amplify it as much to see it. But if you do it to amplify it 20 times and you don't see a signal, and then continue amplifying it, then you might see a signal eventually, but it means that there's much less virus. So the green line we're looking at is for, this is in England before Delta is the way to interpret, before the SGTF. This is before Omicron. So we interpret the green as Delta. And so this viral load, what this is telling us, this graph, is that this viral load is much, much higher. Delta's viral load was much, much higher than the viral load for Omicron. And so the question that sometimes comes up is, how can Omicron be so much more contagious than Delta if Delta has so much more virus that's produced? And what we think is happening is that, so typically, in order to have a probability of getting infected, you actually need to be exposed to multiple virus particles. And so with Delta, maybe you need to be exposed to hundreds of virus particles in order to get infected. Whereas with Omicron, maybe all you need is to be infected with 10 virus particles or 5 virus particles. So it's more infectious. The infectivity is higher per virus particle, but it's shedding less virus as a whole. So there's less viral shedding. So that's good news. The reason is that typically what we found in the past is that the higher the viral load, the more severe the disease. So if this is true, and we're seeing in England here, and the reason that this is important is that England did not have as high previous infection rate as South Africa, then that means that a lot more people would be susceptible, and presumably would have, if it had a higher viral load in the more susceptible people, you would have seen a number closer to Delta. And so the fact that we don't is really, really good news. And for me, this could be really promising news that it's not going to be very severe. Now, if Omicron ends up, so I calculated back in the envelope, there's maybe 50, 60 million people who are still susceptible, who have not been vaccinated and not previously infected with COVID in the United States, in a country of over 300 million. If that's the case, then if Omicron spreads so fast and infects virtually everyone soon, even if the risk of severe disease drops dramatically as a percentage. If you increase the total number, and you're looking at 50, 60 million people, we could still be looking at a lot of hospitalizations that are about to come and a lot of deaths simply because so many people are going to get infected. So we're not out of the woods yet with this idea. But my point of view is this: if we find out that in general, among people who are vaccinated, among people who are previously infected, and people who have no immune memory at all, if we find that the Omicron variant tends to be less severe in general, more like a cold, then this is amazingly good news, because then is going to drive out Delta. It's going to drive Delta away because Omicron is so much more contagious, and this would be the end of the whole pandemic. And by that I mean not just in terms of waiting through March or May. We could be talking about this ending in January if Omicron is far less severe. So there is some good news. We haven't really seen any news that's disturbing yet that would counter. Usually you see some news that's good, some that's bad, trying to figure out the sum of evidence. Here it all seems good. But again, the qualifications are the ones that I gave you, where the most of the data so far is in, say, South Africa, where it's all these younger people and the previous infection and all that. So we still don't know yet. We'll probably know a little bit more in a couple of weeks, but there's a potential for this to be really, really good on an upside, and the potential for it to be really bad is getting less and less likely.
Well, as always, we'll take your good news as it comes your way. So we will stay positive and hopeful. So
Thanks.
we're about at our time together, but I'm wondering if we could kind of wrap up with two last questions. Jane and Sid had a question about children. So if you could unmute and ask your question, that would be great, please.
Yeah, hi, Glenn.
Hey.
Just curious about, we have a 4-year-old grandson who obviously is unvaccinated, and we are traveling over the holidays, and just curious, so how severe are the 4-year-olds, God forbid, if they do get infected? Are they hospitalized at a higher rate? Do they get sicker than the older people?
Yes,
And what should we be concerned with?
lots of questions there. So let me start with hospitalizations first. That's broken up by age, but the smallest age group is age under 17. Much of these were unvaccinated, and a 17-year-old has a much higher risk than a 4-year-old. But if we look at under 17, we tend to think they're at much lower risk than the older people, and they are. But yet, since August of 2020, so it doesn't capture before August, there were 71,000 hospitalizations of people younger than 18. So that's still a lot. So the risk is higher than a lot of people are appreciating, I think, in this age group of under 17s. The majority of those are going to be among the post-pubescent people, so 14 to 17 or whatever. And so under, it's going to be much less. In terms of the total deaths, it doesn't say that here, but this is a lot of hospitalizations. Among the under 4-year-old, it's still a considerable issue. The other things that we're looking at are a few things. One is this idea of long COVID. Long COVID doesn't appear to occur as much in kids as in older people, so that's good news, but it still does exist in some. There's some other things that we worry about. We worry about this MISC, MISC, this multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. It's still pretty rare. I'll just look at it now. But by rare, I mean it's still a thing. So far, we found around 6,000 patients meeting this definition with COVID since the COVID epidemic occurred in the United States. For some reason, it's occurring more in some places than others. So I don't know if that will influence you at all. It could be that there's other things going on in terms of diagnosis or whatnot. I don't know what explains the geographical variation that we're seeing here. But so yeah, this is still something we don't fully understand, and it's a serious issue, but a rare issue. So it's still something. It's a reason that if you have young kids, it's a good reason to keep them protected. If we go back to the previous let me go back to what we were just looking at. So if we look at pediatrics on this one, so if we look at the 0 to 4-year-olds, a lot of the spread. So we looked at this a little bit earlier. This breaks it down by region. I'm just going to look at the regions in general. You'll notice across the board, the 0 to 4-year-olds who are the dotted lines have far less exposure than the older people. So the 5 to 11 are the dashed, and the 12 to 17 are the solid lines. And so that's likely because the older kids are going to school and are catching it from their peers, whereas the younger kids are mostly staying at home. And so that largely explains that this is mostly household transmission. We do know that that the Omicron virus has dramatically more household transmission than the Delta virus did. So if people are, I mean, I can show the exact stats because some people might be interested. If I can pull that up real quickly. I don't have it real quickly. Anyway, okay, here it is. So 19% of Omicron index cases infected at least one other person in their household, whereas only 8% of Delta cases infected at least one other person in their household. So again, this is for anyone in their household at whatever age level. So Omicron is almost twice as likely to infect someone else as who lives in their household. The same thing outside of the household, we see at the same type of ratios. Reinfections, I'll just say real quickly, people with Omicron are 5 times more likely to get reinfected with Omicron than they were with Delta. But going back to your 4-year-old question, there still is a legitimate risk. The risk is very small for kids under age 5. The younger they are, the better it is. I mean, we've been talking for a while, like these other coronaviruses that just cause the common cold. One of the reasons that they're just cause a common cold is because we believe it's because we're all first infected when we're like 1 year old or less. So so under 4, the younger they are, the better it is for them. All right.
Thank you for the great question. Glenn, we're just about at our time together. We have a lot of questions about monoclonal antibodies. Can we wrap there? What do you think?
I'll wrap there for sure. There are 2 things with monoclonal antibodies. I just want to say in 15 seconds before we move on there, one interesting analysis I saw was overlaying all-cause mortality with the COVID diagnosis in South Africa. And because this is another way of looking at it that could tell us about severity. Because if there are, so typically the excess mortality actually occurred before, you saw a signal before the green cases started to increase in South Africa. And that was because South Africa was doing a poor job of diagnosing cases. And so already in some of this data, they could have already seen something was coming. And we saw it in each of the previous surges. In contrast, with this surge now, there was no initial spike of excess mortality. This could be due to 2 things. One, it could be due to a less severe spike, and that's why we're not seeing excess mortality, or it could be due to the fact that the spike is happening so fast, like I've said before, that maybe we're just not seeing it yet. And we are seeing, this could just be noise. We are seeing something might be happening, but it's interesting that it wasn't happening before the surge so far. So it's, again, the evidence could go either way right now. I'm betting it's going to be more mild, but it could go either way. We're still trying to tease it out. All right, back to monoclonal antibodies. All right, a few things here that are really interesting. First, AstraZeneca. So we talked about this many months ago when this was first starting to be studied. We thought, well, monoclonal antibodies and polyclonal antibodies, they are used therapeutically. They're just sort of fake antibodies. They're not your own antibodies. They're just replicated. They're clones of antibodies that are injected or infused into someone who's sick. And then it sort of adds this sort of additional protection for people who have been infected. And so people thought, well, if you're going to do that after someone's infected, why not do it before they're infected? And then they have this window of protection where they don't even have to worry about severe disease because they have all this massive amount of antibodies floating around. And so at first, the problem is that these antibodies tend to just die off on their own. And so the protection might last anywhere from a month to 3 months. And it's not exactly clear, it probably varies by person. And so the problem is this AstraZeneca was trying to develop monoclonal antibodies, polyclonal antibodies that could last longer than 3 months. And so what they tried to do was to, I think, have it last 6 months. If I recall in the clinical trials, I don't remember if it says here, but let's just go with that. I believe it was 6 months. And so what they found is that using their set of monoclonal antibodies, which is actually a mixture of these two things, tixagevimab and silagevimab, so AZD8895 and AZD1061, this combination can protect people for 6 months, which is really good news. And so in particular, people who are immunocompromised, so for instance, if they're on an immunosuppressant drug, or they're immunocompromised because they have a disease area that causes them to be immunocompromised, or maybe if they're a very old age, and so that their regular vaccines don't last as long as they have less antibodies, then this would be another reason to take these maybe prophylactically. All of these people could potentially benefit. But here is the problem. All right, so recently there's been a few studies trying to see how well the different monoclonal and polyclonal antibodies work against the different variants. So against Delta, everything works pretty well. So as I just mentioned, this Evusheld that I just mentioned is AZD8895 and AZD1061. 8895 and 1061, these are these two. It works amazingly well against Delta. The problem is, as you see, it barely works at all against Omicron. And so this is problematic. In addition, when you look at Regeneron's monoclonal antibodies, they work against everything except Omicron. Nothing really seems to work against Omicron very well, except these two, VIR7831 and DXP604. VIR781 is also called, did I bring it out? I was trying to bring it out. It's called, so I'm not going to be able to pronounce it. Just give me 1 second to pull it up because it's so important. All right, so VIR781 is called sotrovimab. Okay, I mostly tortured that word. This one, again, is the only one that's been shown to be very effective against Omicron. So depending on people who get severe illness, this is going to become much more important. Now, we don't know how many people are going to be hospitalized and develop severe illness, but if they do, this is suddenly the hot commodity. It is an emergency use it has been given an emergency use authorization in the United States. I don't know what its access is in other countries yet. The other one here that I mentioned, this one, it looks to be a little bit less effective. This DXP604 is a Chinese medicine. I'm not sure if I don't believe it has emergency use authorization yet in the United States. So that means basically what we're looking at is this one, is the sotrovimab. This is made by GSK, and so it's also, I think they also partnered with someone else in terms of developing it. No, that's not it. And so GSK is the one that did this. Anyway, in the future, because this affects both, this protects against Omicron and Delta. For everyone who's listening here, if you are now hospitalized with severe disease, and first of all, for a lot of people, once you're hospitalized, it's too late to get any of these monoclonal antibodies. You really need to take them when you have mild disease, but you're at high risk of developing severe disease. So for instance, if someone was 80 years old, got infected with the virus, then you'd probably want to put them on a monoclonal antibody to prevent them from progressing to severe disease. And so you'd have to give these early on. Going forward, given this data and other data that's consistent with this, everyone on this call and anyone that we might know should probably start trying to find and using instead of Regeneron or some of these others, using this one, the sotrovimab, just because it's effective against Delta and Omicron. So then you don't have to worry about which it might possibly be. All right, that was the first thing about monoclonal antibodies. I think that was everything I wanted to say. Let me just see if there's anything else. It's the same. You can look at it. I like this table. It pulls it out really well from this study that's here, that was published. Really well done study. You can also look at it in the graphs. That makes it pop out a little bit more. So you can see down here, the blue line is Omicron, and nothing seems to be really impacting Omicron very much at all, except that, like you can see, the major efficacy from the drug I just mentioned, this VIR 7831. So yeah, that's what we have there. Other things about the monoclonal antibodies, I think that's it. Why don't we call it a day? There's a lot of other great questions, but we'll call it a day. We'll meet back here in 2 weeks. So it's the Sunday after Christmas.
Right, the 26th, 7 p.m. And Glenn, as always, you have done such a fabulous job compiling all of the answers to the so many great questions that keep coming in. Here we are, months and months and years into this. So thank you to this incredibly engaged audience, both on the call today and those watching on YouTube. Please keep sending in your questions, and Glenn will keep answering them. Right, Glenn?
Yes. Hello.
All right. Be well, be safe, everybody. Happy holidays, and we'll see you again on the 26th. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Thanks, Rebecca.